You'll see my talk is in two really quite separate parts. I think both parts relate to lots of what the previous speakers today have been talking about, and if other people can synthesize the two into one, then you're doing a better job than I can. Let me start off by talking about digital jobs in Europe as we saw them in 2010, the last time I got good data on these sorts of things, and then I'm going to go on to look at what's going on for young people in developing countries and self-employment and how well that rhetoric of entrepreneurship and those new digital jobs and the working on these platforms, how well it sits with the data I've got from the ILO. So there you are, looking at, first of all, digital jobs in Europe. I'll define them, I'll show how prevalent they are by this particular definition. But then, most importantly, I'm going to look at what sort of quality they are. Are these concerns that people have got of digital jobs, of destroying all those things that we associated with the good things about regular employment, to the extent to which those things are borne out in the data? I'm not sure people can see this, how well people can see this back there. I've tried to lift my slides up a bit. I realise people sitting at the back can't see the bottom bits of the slides. So this is a very simple way of operationalising digital jobs. This is using the European Working Conditions Survey in 2010. And the data I've pulled together here is for all 27 countries, the member states at that time in 2010. The 2015 data has been collected now but hasn't been released, so it is a bit out of date. Something's moving rapidly. It's a great data set in some ways, particularly when we want to look at the details of what people are doing in their jobs and the overall job quality. What I've done here is pulled together two questions that were asked, because there's a whole load of questions where the question always starts: does your main job involve ... And one of those things is using the internet or email for professional purposes, and another one is working with computers, PCs, networks, mainframes. And if we cross-tabulate those two, and I'm just going to simply split it in two because they're asked whether these things apply from all of the time down to never. And I've got a cut-off point, so the people are using email and internet for professional purposes more than half the time, so 3/4 of the time, almost all of the time, or all the time. And I've done the same, applied the same cuts for people using PCs, networks, and mainframes. And that gives us 26% of people who say their job involves using email and internet and using personal computers most of the time. I have tried other cuts on the data, and the analyses I'm going to show are not at all sensitive to cutting it in different ways. In fact, I spent a lot of time cutting the data in different ways, looking at just at Britain, looking at EU27, looking at particular occupations that have gone digital over the past, say, couple of decades. And generally speaking, there are small differences. Some of the effects are slightly stronger in Europe as a whole than they are in the UK. But overall, I think the results I'm going to show you are very robust to different ways of analysing. So we've got these 26% of jobs that are digital jobs. Let's first of all see where they're occurring. Sorry, no, I'm going to, let me go on to that then. So the incidence, where do these jobs occur? Slightly more women are doing these jobs than men. There's a surprisingly flat age profile because, again, for some other ways in which people are conceptualizing digital jobs, we're very much associated with the sorts of things that young people are doing. So I had a lot of evidence about young people. You could see in those photographs of the people in developing countries, a lot of them were young people, but surprisingly flat age profile, but a very strong education profile here. So much more likely to be people with tertiary education, very low levels of digital jobs for people with very low levels of education. And if we look at the countries across Europe, you can see they're averaging around that 26%. At the top end are Luxembourg, Ireland, and the UK, followed by many of the Scandinavian and other Western European countries. So again, there's a few surprises in there. Germany comes surprisingly low down in that level, but by and large, not unexpected prevalence across countries. So what I'm interested in, though, is not so much where these jobs occur, but are they good jobs or bad jobs? Kevin's, lousy jobs or whatever it was. You're lousy or lovely or lousy, yeah. But again, I would contest the fact that we ever really thought about it as a dualistic, as just two single categories. I think we probably did before we had any good sort of data on it. And if you go back 30 years ago, there were lots of good theories, but we were very short of data to test it on. But as soon as we realised that there was data around, we could see the heterogeneity, but as you're saying quite correctly, it's not just on a simple unidimensional. There are many different ways in which there are problems are manifest with certain jobs, low quality jobs occur in very different ways and aren't necessarily associated with, simultaneously low pay, part-time, low education and so on. What I've done here to try and capture this idea of job quality is using a scheme which may be familiar to some people in the room, Francis Green's way of putting job quality into 7 dimensions. There are 4 big categories. Income, here I've operationalized it as monthly income. The prospects of the job, again, not simply to do with the contract that people have got, but also their own sense of security, and not only their ability to keep their current job, but to be trained so they can go on to better jobs, hopefully on a stable and upward trajectory in the best cases. There's working time quality, again capturing many things that Jill was talking about, not just not working very long hours, but also not working unsociable hours, having some control over hours yourself and not being entirely controlled by the whim of the employer, as in many zero-hour contract situations. And then the 4th is intrinsic job quality, and this again Francis Green breaks down into skills and discretion, particularly that discretion, being able to use your own judgment in your job, a good social environment, feeling supported, not being bullied, that sort of thing, a good physical environment, a safe environment, not having to work in tiring positions and so on. And then the absence of work intensity, that pressure of work which so many people complain about, relentless, tight deadlines, always a sense that you've got too much to do and not enough time to do it in. So how do our digital jobs, how bad are they in these ways? If we first look at monthly income, and the dark blue are the digital jobs, the light blue are the old-fashioned jobs. And the reason I first got interested in this, by the way, was I was approached by a government department that were going digital, and they were concerned about the effect it had on job quality. Digital jobs are better paying in Europe. They have better prospects, people feel more secure in those jobs. They have more higher level, that's not such a great difference, but intrinsic job quality, we'll pick that apart in a bit, but they have better working time on average. Not working long hours, not having to work weekends and evenings and those sorts of things. Then if we pick apart this intrinsic job quality, the digital jobs, people claim they can use their own discretion more in their work. A small difference, but again it's significant. Better social environments, people feeling involved, listened to in the workplace, those sorts of things. A better physical environment. And in case you're thinking, is this because of that higher level of education, the better jobs and so on, these are all controlling for gender, age, education, occupation and industry. It's overall looking very good. I'm cheating a little bit. There is one thing, if we go to that final bit, that absence of work intensity, and here we see the reversal. And here I think when you listen to people talking about particularly the use of email in work, you were getting to the heart of the one time, and this comes out again and again, this comes out in all the analyses I do pretty much, that intensity, the way that there isn't a natural pause in the working day between jobs, the way that work seems relentless, and anybody who gets a continual stream of emails, so even as you take time out to do half an hour presentation, you know when you go back to your computer there's going to be a load of emails there waiting for you, can understand that. So there is one way in which these digital jobs, as they are being performed in Europe in 2010, are particularly problematic. But in all sorts of other ways, they seem to be the good jobs across the whole spectrum. So that's it. That's the first half of my talk. Now let's go to another world entirely. We'll leave Europe. We're going to developing countries. And in particular, this is, again, drawing a sort of small part of a project I did for the ILO looking at youth self-employment. So skipping over quickly, we know we've had again talks about self-employment and what it is, what that relationship is, and how in many situations it's contested. When does an employer have a responsibility, and when is it a subcontracting type relationship between two equals? And we talk a lot about own account workers. Some people, and it was mentioned this morning, talk about cooperatives, although in my data, when we look at large data sets generally, there is such a small fraction of people working in those ways that really I couldn't do much about it, and they don't seem of great consequence. There's a very small group of employers, and when we come back to again that talk about entrepreneurship, there's a lot of talk about them, but actually, particularly for young people, these are a tiny proportion of people who are self-employed. Most self-employed people, their own account workers, they're never going to employ anybody else. There's another category, a group that I never really thought about much before because most of my work has been in Europe, and that's family workers, people who really, they're working, they're clearly employed in labour, they're working, but they're not getting a separate wage for it, they're contributing to a family's income, particularly in agricultural work, but by no means confined to that. I had a data set, I came across a data set, in some ways it was very impressive. It had over 100,000 cases of people who are below the age of 30 from 28 countries, developing countries from pretty much all parts of the world. And we had not only details of their current activities, their current, a few measures of job quality, their job search activities, so on, but also, and very, what should have been a very good resource was their activity history. So we had every single job they'd had, either since they started economic activity, because they didn't have any education, or when they left full-time education. As it turned out, the quality of the data in this data set was very poor, so a lot of the things that I was hoping to with it just didn't work out. But we can see, first of all, a lot of discussion about job quality of self-employed workers in this country, and lots of the findings very much parallel the findings we got from developing countries. Occasionally we see big differences. But certainly it's the case that overall 23% of those who are economically active were self-employed. In the poorest countries by GDP is 36%, so quite a strong gradient there. But also we can see, again, in these poorest countries, 29% of people who are economically active are there as family workers among these young people. A huge category that certainly in Western Europe hardly exists. If we look at it by region rather than just by level of economic development, we get even more stark differences. So now if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, of the young people who are economically active, 43% say they're self-employed, 29% family workers. So huge categories, huge numbers here. To what extent are they the sort of people who are going to be these entrepreneurial online workers on these platforms? The mix of job quality indicators is quite complex to pick apart. In some ways, and in these developing countries, they say they're less satisfied with their jobs, and there's lots of indicators that they're forced into these jobs rather than actively taking those jobs. But it's not that great a difference, and that is an important difference. In the UK, even though the difference in job quality is very clear, people who are self-employed say they're more satisfied with the working situation, so which is a challenging finding. But they do say positive things about them. Lots of them say they chose to be self-employed because it gives them greater independence. 13% say they're self-employed because their family makes them. They have to be. They've got no choice in the matter. We also what their main problems are. They talk about money a lot. They also talk about competition a lot. So again, although their Dutch auctions aren't as refined as you get on the online platforms, you've got the same sort of situation here of an oversupply of labour into some relatively narrow niches in the labour market that require little setup cost, little capital. And with so many people, young people, competing for this small amount of demand, they're undercutting each other all the time. It's that competition. So it makes you think as the more we try to stimulate those sectors of the economy, the more we're providing competition if we're just trying to stimulate the supply side, and the worse we're making for people there. There also, self-employment is characterised by low parental education. People come from more disadvantaged backgrounds. I won't talk about income because of time pressures, but going on to look at their work histories, and again this resonates with Kevin's work, by looking at the average duration that people are spending. If we start off with that assumption, as so many people do, that short duration jobs, the worst jobs, they're the ones that are most precarious, the high turnover. In fact, we see that self-employment, and there may be problems with the data here to do with repeat spells, those people in self-employment, they're actually spending 17 months in their job on average, whereas it's only 13 months for people in employment, and probably the vast majority of this employment is informal sector employment. So actually self-employment seems to be a more stable form of employment. But by far away the most stable form of employment is work as an unpaid family member. So it really does, we're getting a picture here. We're not talking necessarily maybe about the advantage of being kept in a job so you can develop skills and so on. We're talking about people who get stuck into ruts in the labour market. The labour market flow data was truly horrendous and took days and days of coding to try and make any sense of it at all, just because the data was so complex. It was riddled with errors and poorly analysed. But if we look at the flows, if we look at where people are coming from and going to, we see that it's clearly not random, but there's very clear categories, if you like, clusters that people are cycling between. People who are self-employed often become family workers, and when they're family workers, they become self-employed. And between these, they often have periods of economic inactivity. So it does seem that when people say they're self-employed, often they're still doing something that's very much rooted in a family business. Again, it could be agricultural, whatever, and they're going between us. So probably that's where we've got a very fuzzy boundary. People often redefining the same thing. Whereas we've got other people who are going from employed into unemployed and back again, sometimes with periods of inactivity. Again, obviously gender differences there, with inactivity being more common for women than for men. But very little by way of flows between self-employment and being an employee. It's as if we've got two quite separate labour markets. How we argue about how useful it is to think of a dual labour market theory or whatever, I do think one of the very important lessons that was learnt out of that school of thought, if you like, is that if we try and look at the labour market as we do with other markets as being a single market, we're going to misunderstand it. We're not going to capture what's going on. We need to think of it as separate markets where different rules apply. And if you think of it in that stylized, simplistic way of a primary or secondary, primary being high wage, high skilled, powerful people controlling their own work, future-oriented, upward trajectories and so on, secondary labour markets being all the opposite of those things. It seems to me, even more true of self-employment. So when we're looking at this self-employment, we shouldn't be asking, is self-employment better or worse than being an employee? The massive thing is that they're far more heterogeneous. So that there are some really good, some really fantastic self-employed jobs out there, and there's a lot more that are really dire jobs, and and as long as we're just trying to think of the averages, we miss that important thing. There's all sorts of people who have alluded to this in the literature and talk about different typologies. Again, we just haven't had the quality of data to really try and understand this and in the way that we've been able to understand employment in Europe. So whether we talk about people whose goal is to grow the business rather than just to survive, the people who are using capital, or whether it's just their own labour they're using, there's very clearly a big male-female division here. The extent to which they're rooted in family networks, the extent to which, and often these people are combining, they've got multiple sources of income to make things more complex. These are people who are often, say, a civil servant during the day and a street trader in the evening. So very complex to get one's head round. Are they entrepreneurs? Again, because this word has come back into fashion very much in terms of talking about digital jobs, and I think they just everything we see about them suggests they're not entrepreneurs, they're not breaking out, they're not recreating markets, styling them in their own way. These are people who are, even if they're calling themselves self-employed without employees, very often they've got family help. They're rooted in, and if anything, the ones that have got that family help, those networks, are the more successful ones. To try and create these people as lone entrepreneurs without that family background, it has got a very low chance of success. So I ought to end there, but just to say, I think we've been suckered into, in a way it's been rejected before, again and again, this often neoliberal agenda, a discourse of entrepreneurship, thinking people who are employees, the people in this room, we're the boring ones, but there are brave individuals out there who are going to recreate the world. Certainly for the people I'm studying, those people in developing countries, this really doesn't apply. If anything, the entrepreneurs are the people who break out of poverty and self-employment through education and get into formal work. So maybe I should leave it there because I've run out of time. But like I say, I think talking about quality digital jobs in Europe is an important thing to do. Talking about the really poor quality of self-employment in developing countries is an important thing to do. But trying to put the two together, I just don't think they go. Okay.